Rhiann, wife of Huor, dwelt with the people of the house of Hador. But when rumour came to Dor-lomin of the Neaneath Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears, and yet she could hear no news of her lord, she became distraught and wandered forth into the wild alone. There she would have perished, but the grey elves came to her aid. For there was a dwelling of this people in the mountains westward of Lake Mithrim, and thither they led her, and she was there delivered of a son before the end of the year of lamentation. And Rhiann said to the elves, Let him be called Tuor, for that name his father chose ere war came between us. And I beg of you to foster him, and to keep him hidden in your care, for I forebode that great good for elves and men shall come from him. But I must go in search of Huor, my lord. Then the elves pitied her, but one Anael, who alone of all that went to war from that people had returned from the Neaneath, said to her, Alas, lady, it is known now that Huor fell at the side of Hurin his brother, and he lies, I deem, in the great hill of slain that the orcs have raised upon the field of battle. Therefore Rhiann arose and left the dwelling of the elves, and she passed through the land of Mithrim, and came at last to the Houth en Endengin, in the waste of Anfauglith, and there she laid her down and died. But the elves cared for the infant son of Huor, and Tuor grew up among them, and he was fair of face, and golden-haired after the manner of his father's kin, and he became strong and tall and valiant, and being fostered by the elves he had lore and skill no less than the princes of the Edain, ere ruin came upon the north. But with the passing of the years the life of the former folk of Hithlum, such as still remained, elves or men, became ever harder and more perilous. For, as is elsewhere told, Morgoth broke his pledges to the Easterlings that had served him, and he denied to them the rich lands of Beleriand which they had coveted, and he drove away these evil folk into Hithlum, and there commanded them to dwell. And though they loved Morgoth no longer, they served him still in fear, and hated all the elven folk, and they despised the remnant of the house of Hador, the aged in women and children for the most part, and they oppressed them, and wedded their women by force, and took their lands and goods, and enslaved their children. Orcs came and went about the land as they would, pursuing the lingering elves into the fastnesses of the mountains, and taking many captive to the mines of Angband, to labour as the thralls of Morgoth. Therefore Anael led his small people to the caves of Androth, and there they lived a hard and wary life, until Tuor was 16 years of age and was become strong and able to wield arms, the axe and bow of the grey elves. And his heart grew hot within him at the tale of the griefs of his people, and he wished to go forth and avenge them on the Orcs and Easterlings. But Anael forbade this. Far hence, I deem, your doom lies, Tuor, son of Huor, he said. And this land shall not be freed from the shadow of Morgoth until Thangorodrim itself be overthrown. Therefore we are resolved at last to forsake it, and to depart into the south, and with us you shall go. But how shall we escape the net of our enemies? Said Tuor. For the marching of so many together will surely be marked. We shall not march through the land openly, said Anael. And if our fortune is good, we shall come to the secret way which we call Anon in Gelith, the gate of the Noldor. For it was made by the skill of that people long ago in the days of Turgon. At that name Tuor was stirred, though he knew not why. And he questioned Anael concerning Turgon. He is a son of Fingolfin, said Anael, and is now accounted High King of the Noldor since the fall of Fingon. For he lives yet, most feared of the foes of Morgoth, and he escaped from the ruin of the Neaneath, when Hurin of Dor-lomin and Huor your father held the passes of Sirion behind him. Then I will go and seek Turgon, said Tuor, "for surely he will lend me aid for my father's sake." "That you cannot," said Anael, "for his stronghold is hidden from the eyes of elves and men, and we know not where it stands. Of the Noldor some, may be, know the way thither, but they will speak of it to none. Yet if you would have speech with them, then come with me as I bid you, for in the far havens of the south you may meet with wanderers from the hidden kingdom." Thus it came to pass that the elves forsook the caves of Androth, and Tuor went with them. But their enemies kept watch upon their dwellings, and were soon aware of their march, and they had not gone far from the hills into the plain before they were assailed by a great force of orcs and easterlings, and they were scattered far and wide, fleeing into the gathering night. But Tuor's heart was kindled with the fire of battle, and he would not flee, but boy as he was, he wielded the axe as his father before him. And for long he stood his ground and slew many that assailed him, but at the last he was overwhelmed and taken captive, and led before Lorgan the Easterling. Now this Lorgan was held the chief of the Easterlings, and claimed to rule all Dor-lomin as a fief under Morgoth, and he took Tuor to be his slave. Hard and bitter then was his life, for it pleased Lorgan to treat Tuor the more evilly as he was of the kin of the former lords, and he sought to break, if he could, the pride of the house of Hador. But Tuor saw wisdom, and endured all pains and taunts with watchful patience, so that in time his lot was somewhat lightened, and at the least he was not starved, as were many of Lorgan's unhappy thralls. For he was strong and skilful, and Lorgan fed his beasts of burden well, while they were young and could work. But after 3 years of thraldom, Tuor saw at last a chance of escape. He was come now almost to his full stature, taller and swifter than any of the Easterlings, and being sent with other thralls on an errand of labour into the woods, he turned suddenly on the guards and slew them with an axe, and fled into the hills. The Easterlings hunted him with dogs, but without avail, for well-nigh all the hounds of Lorgan were his friends, and if they came up with him they would fawn upon him, and then run homeward at his command. Thus he came back at last to the caves of Androth, and dwelt there alone. And for 4 years he was an outlaw in the land of his fathers, grim and solitary. And his name was feared, for he went often abroad, and slew many of the Easterlings that he came upon. Then they set a great price upon his head, but they did not dare to come to his hiding place, even with strength of men, for they feared the elven folk, and shunned the caves where they had dwelt. Yet it is said that Tuor's journeys were not made for the purpose of vengeance. Rather he sought ever for the gate of the Noldor, of which Anael had spoken. But he found it not, for he knew not where to look, and such few of the elves as lingered in the mountains had not heard of it. Now Tuor knew that though fortune still favoured him, yet in the end the days of an outlaw are numbered, and are ever few and without hope. Nor was he willing to live thus forever a wild man in the houseless hills, and his heart urged him ever to great deeds. Herein it is said the power of Ulmo was shown, for he gathered tidings of all that passed in Beleriand, and every stream that flowed from Middle-earth to the great sea was to him a messenger both to and fro. And he remained also in friendship, as of old, with Círdan and the shipwrights at the mouths of Sirion. And at this time, most of all, Ulmo gave heed to the fates of the house of Hador. For in his deep counsels he purposed that they should play great part in his designs for the succour of the exiles. And he knew well of the plight of Tuor, for Anael and many of his folk had indeed escaped from Dor-lomin, and come at last to Círdan in the far south.
This is Círdan the shipwright, who appears in The Lord of the Rings as the Lord of the Grey Havens at the end of the Third Age.
Thus it came to pass that on a day in the beginning of the year, 23 since the Nearneath, Tuor sat by a spring that trickled forth near to the door of the cave where he dwelt, and he looked out westward towards the cloudy sunset. Then suddenly it came into his heart that he would wait no longer, but would arise and go. "I will leave now the grey land of my kin that are no more," he cried, "and I will go in search of my doom. But whither shall I turn? Long have I sought the gate, and found it not." Then he took up the harp which he bore ever with him, being skilled in playing upon its strings, and heedless of the peril of his clear voice alone in the waste, he sang an elven song of the north for the uplifting of hearts. And even as he sang, the well at his feet began to boil with great increase of water, and it overflowed, and a rill ran noisily down the rocky hillside before him. And Tuor took this as a sign, and he arose at once and followed after it. Thus he came down from the tall hills of Mithrim, and passed out into the northward plain of Dor Lomin. And ever the stream grew as he followed it westward, until after 3 days he could descry in the west the long grey ridges of Ered Lomin, that in those regions marched north and south, fencing off the far coastlands of the western shores. To those hills in all his journeys Tuor had never come. Now the land became more broken and stony again as it approached the hills, and soon it began to rise before Tuor's feet, and the stream went down into a cloven bed. But even as dim dusk came on the 3rd day of his journey, Tuor found before him a wall of rock, and there was an opening therein like a great arch, and the stream passed in and was lost. Then Tuor was dismayed, and he said, "So my hope has cheated me. The sign in the hills has led me only to a dark end in the midst of the land of my enemies." And grey at heart he sat among the rocks on the high bank of the stream, keeping watch through a bitter, fireless night. For it was yet but the month of Sulimeh, and no stir of spring had come to that far northern land, and a shrill wind blew from the east. But even as the light of the coming sun shone pale in the far mists of Mithrim, Tuor heard voices, and looking down he saw in amazement 2 elves that waded in the shallow water, and as they climbed up steps hewn in the bank, Tuor stood up and called to them. At once they drew their bright swords and sprang towards him. Then he saw that they were grey-cloaked, but mail-clad under, and he marvelled, for they were fairer and more fell to look upon because of the light of their eyes than any of the elven folk that he yet had known. He stood to his full height and awaited them. But when they saw that he drew no weapon, but stood alone and greeted them in the elven tongue, they sheathed their swords and spoke courteously to him. And one said, "Gelmir and Amenas we are, of Finarfin's people. Are you not one of the Edain of old, that dwelt in these lands ere the Nirnaeth? And indeed of the kindred of Hador and Hurin I deem you, for so the gold of your head declares you." And Tuor answered, "Yea, I am Tuor, son of Huor, son of Galdor, son of Hador. But now at last I desire to leave this land where I am outlawed and kinless." "Then," said Gelmir, "if you would escape and find the havens in the south, already your feet have been guided on the right road." "So I thought," said Tuor, "for I followed a sudden spring of water in the hills until it joined this treacherous stream. But now I know not whither to turn, for it has gone into darkness." "Through darkness one may come to the light," said Gelmir. "Yet one will walk under the sun while one may," said Tuor. "But since you are of that people, tell me if you can where lies the gate of the Noldor, for I have sought it long, ever since Anael, my foster-father of the Grey Elves, spoke of it to me." Then the elves laughed and said, "Your search is ended, for we have ourselves just passed that gate. There it stands before you." And they pointed to the arch into which the water flowed. "Come now, Through darkness you shall come to the light. We will set your feet on the road, but we cannot guide you far, for we are sent back to the lands whence we fled upon an urgent errand. But fear not, said Gelmir. A great doom is written upon your brow, and it shall lead you far from these lands, far indeed from Middle-earth, as I guess. Then Tuor followed the Noldor down the steps and waded in the cold water, until they passed into the shadow beyond the Arch of Stone. And then Gelmir brought forth one of those lamps for which the Noldor were renowned, for they were made of old in Valinor, and neither wind nor water could quench them, and when they were unhooded, they sent forth a clear blue light from a flame imprisoned in white crystal. Now by the light that Gelmir held above his head, Tuor saw that the river began to go suddenly down a smooth slope into a great tunnel. But beside its rock-hewn course there ran long flights of steps, leading on and downward into a deep gloom beyond the beam of the lamp. When they had come to the foot of the rapids, they stood under a great dome of rock, and there the river rushed over a steep fall with a great noise that echoed in the vault, and it passed then on again under another arch into a further tunnel. Beside the falls the Noldor halted and bade Tuor farewell. "Now we must return and go our ways with all speed," said Gelmir, "for matters of great peril are moving in Beleriand." "Is then the hour when Turgon shall come forth?" said Tuor. Then the elves looked at him in amazement. "That is a matter which concerns the Noldor rather than the sons of men," said Arminas. "What know you of Turgon?" "Little," said Tuor, "save that my father aided his escape from the Nirnaeth, and that in his stronghold dwells the hope of the Noldor. Yet, though I know not why, ever his name stirs in my heart and comes to my lips. And had I my will, I would go in search of him rather than tread this dark way of dread, unless perhaps this secret road is the way to his dwelling." "Who shall say?" answered the elf. "For since the dwelling of Turgon is hidden, so also are the ways thither. I know them not, though I have sought them long. Yet if I knew them, I would not reveal them to you, nor to any among men." But Gelmir said, "I have heard that your house has the favour of the Lord of Waters, and if his counsels lead you to Turgon, then surely shall you come to him, whithersoever you turn. Follow now the road to which the water has brought you from the hills, and fear not. You shall not walk long in darkness. Farewell, and think not that our meeting was by chance, for the dweller in the deep moves many things in this land still. Anar Kaluva Tieliana. The sun will shine upon your path." With that the Noldor turned and went back up the long stairs, but Tuor stood still until the light of their lamp was lost, and he was alone in a darkness deeper than night amid the roaring of the falls. Then, summoning his courage, he set his left hand to the rock wall, and felt his way forward, slowly at first, and then more quickly, as he became more used to the darkness and found nothing to hinder him. And after a great while, as it seemed to him, when he was weary and yet unwilling to rest in the black tunnel, he saw far before him a light. And hastening on, he came to a tall and narrow cleft, and followed the noisy stream between its leaning walls, out into a golden evening. For he was come into a deep ravine with tall, sheer sides, and it ran straight towards the west. And before him the setting sun, going down through a clear sky, shone into the ravine and kindled its walls with yellow fire, and the waters of the river glittered like gold as they broke and foamed upon many gleaming stones. In that deep place Tuor went on now in great hope and delight, finding a path beneath the southern wall, where there lay a long and narrow strand, and when night came, and the river rushed on unseen, save for a glint of high stars mirrored in dark pools. Then he rested and slept, for he felt no fear beside that water, in which the power of Ulmo ran. With the coming of day he went on again without haste. The sun rose behind his back and set before his face, and where the water foamed among the boulders or rushed over sudden falls, at morning and evening rainbows were woven across the stream. Wherefore he named that stream Cirith Niniach, rainbow cleft. Thus Tuor journeyed slowly for 3 days, drinking the cold water but desiring no food, though there were many fish that shone as gold or silver, or gleamed with colours like to the rainbows in the spray above. And on the 4th day the channel grew wider, and its walls lower and less sheer, but the river ran deeper and more strongly, for high hills now marched on either side, and fresh waters spilled from them into Cirith Niniach over shimmering falls. There long while Tuor sat, watching the swirling of the stream and listening to its endless voice, until night came again, and stars shone cold and white in the dark lane of sky above him. Then he lifted up his voice and plucked the strings of his harp, and above the noise of the water the sound of his song and the sweet thrilling of the harp were echoed in the stone and multiplied, and went forth and rang in the night-clad hills, until all the empty land was filled with music beneath the stars. For though he knew it not, Tuor was now come to the echoing mountains of Lamoth, about the firth of Drengist. There once long ago Feanor had landed from the sea, and the voices of his host were swelled to a mighty clamour upon the coasts of the north, ere the rising of the moon. Then Tuor was filled with wonder and stayed his song, and slowly the music died in the hills, and there was silence. And then amid the silence he heard in the air above him a strange cry, and he knew not of what creature that cry came. Now he said, "It is a fey voice." Now, "Nay, it is a small beast that is wailing in the waste." And then hearing it again, he said, "Surely it is the cry of some night-faring bird that I know not." And it seemed to him a mournful sound, and yet he desired none the less to hear it and follow it, for it called him, he knew not whither. The next morning he heard the same voice above his head, and looking up he saw 3 great white birds beating down the ravine against the westerly wind, and their strong wings shone in the new-risen sun, and as they passed over him they wailed aloud. Thus for the first time he beheld the great gulls, beloved of the Teleri. Then Tuor arose to follow them, and so that he might better mark whither they flew, he climbed the cliff upon his left hand and stood upon the top, and felt a great wind out of the west rush against his face, and his hair streamed from his head. And he drank deep of that new air, and said, "This uplifts the heart like the drinking of cool wine." But he knew not that the wind came fresh from the great sea. Now Tuor went on once more, seeking the gulls high above the river, and as he went the sides of the ravine drew together again, and he came to a narrow channel, and it was filled with a great noise of water. And looking down, Tuor saw a great marvel, as it seemed to him. For a wild flood came up the narrows and strove with the river that would still press on, and a wave like a wall rose up almost to the cliff-top, crowned with foam crests flying in the wind. Then the river was thrust back, and the incoming flood swept roaring up the channel, drowning it in deep water, and the rolling of the boulders was like thunder as it passed. Thus Tuor was saved by the call of the sea-birds from death in the rising tide, and that was very great, because of the season of the year and of the high wind from the sea. But now Tuor was dismayed by the fury of the strange waters, and he turned aside and went away southward, and so came not to the long shores of the firth of Drengist. but wandered still for some days in a rugged country bare of trees. And it was swept by a wind from the sea, and all that grew there, herb or bush, leaned ever to the dawn because of the prevalence of that wind from the west. In this way Tuor passed into the borders of Nevrast, where once Turgon had dwelt, and at last, at unawares, for the cliff-tops at the margin of the land were higher than the slopes behind, he came suddenly to the black brink of Middle-earth, and saw the great sea, Belagea the shoreless. And at that hour the sun went down beyond the rim of the world as a mighty fire, and Tuor stood alone upon the cliff with outspread arms, and a great yearning filled his heart. It is said that he was the first of men to reach the great sea, and that none save the Eldar have ever felt more deeply the longing that it brings. Tuor tarried many days in Nevrast, and it seemed good to him, for that land, being fenced by mountains from the north and east, and nigh to the sea, was milder and more kindly than the plains of Hithlum. He was long used to dwell alone as a hunter in the wild, and he found no lack of food, for spring was busy in Nevrast, and the air was filled with the noise of birds, both those that dwelt in multitudes upon the shores, and those that teemed in the marshes of Linaowen in the midst of the hollow land. But in those days no voice of elves or men was heard in all the solitude. To the borders of the great mere Tuor came, but its waters were beyond his reach, because of the wide mires and the pathless forests of reeds that lay all about. And soon he turned away and went back to the coast, for the sea drew him, and he was not willing to dwell long where he could not hear the sound of its waves. And in the shorelands Tuor first found traces of the Noldor of old, for among the tall and sea-hewn cliffs south of Drengist there were many coves and sheltered inlets, with beaches of white sand among the black gleaming rocks. And leading down to such places Tuor found often winding stairs cut in the living stone, and by the water edge were ruined quays, built of great blocks hewn from the cliffs, where elven ships had once been moored. In those regions Tuor long remained, watching the ever-changing sea, while through spring and summer the slow year wore on, and darkness deepened in Beleriand, and the autumn of the doom of Nargothrond drew near. And, maybe, birds saw from afar the fell winter that was to come, for those that were wont to go south gathered early to depart, and others that used to dwell in the north came from their homes to Nevrast. And one day, as Tuor sat upon the shore, he heard the rush and whine of great wings, and he looked up and saw 7 white swans flying in a swift wedge southward. But as they came above him, they wheeled and flew suddenly down, and alighted with a great plash and churning of water. Now Tuor loved swans, which he knew on the grey pools of Mithrim, and the swan moreover had been the token of Anael and his foster folk. He rose therefore to greet the birds, and called to them, marvelling to behold that they were greater and prouder than any of their kind that he had seen before. But they beat their wings and uttered harsh cries, as if they were wroth with him, and would drive him from the shore. Then with a great noise they rose again from the water, and flew above his head, so that the rush of their wings blew upon him as a whistling wind. And wheeling in a wide circle they ascended into the high air, and went away south. Then Tuor cried aloud, "Here now comes another sign that I have tarried too long." And straightway he climbed to the cliff-top, and there he beheld the swans still wheeling on high. But when he turned southward and set out to follow them, they flew swiftly away. Now Tuor journeyed south along the coast for full 7 days, and each morning he was aroused by the rush of wings above him in the dawn, and each day the swans flew on as he followed after. And as he went the great cliffs became lower, and their tops were clothed deep with flowering turf, and away eastward there were woods turning yellow in the waning of the year. But before him, drawing ever nearer, he saw a line of great hills that barred his way, marching westward until they ended in a tall mountain, a dark and cloud-helmed tower reared upon mighty shoulders, above a great green cape thrust out into the sea. Those grey hills were indeed the western outliers of Ered Wethrin, the north fence of Beleriand, and the mountain was Mount Taras, westernmost of all the towers of that land, whose head a mariner would first descry across the miles of the sea as he drew near to the mortal shores. Beneath its long slopes in bygone days Turgon had dwelt in the halls of Vinyamar, eldest of all the works of stone that the Noldor built in the lands of their exile. There it still stood, desolate but enduring, high upon great terraces that looked towards the sea. The years had not shaken it, and the servants of Morgoth had passed it by, but wind and rain and frost had graven it, and upon the coping of its walls and the great shingles of its roof there was a deep growth of grey-green plants that, living upon the salt air, throve even in the cracks of barren stone. Now Tuor came to the ruins of a lost road, and he passed amid green mounds and leaning stones, and so came, as the day was waning, to the old hall and its high and windy courts. No shadow of fear or evil lurked there, but an awe fell upon him, thinking of those that had dwelt there and had gone, none knew whither, the proud people, deathless but doomed from far beyond the sea. And he turned and looked, as often their eyes had looked, out across the glitter of the unquiet waters to the end of sight. Then he turned back again, and saw that the swans had alighted on the highest terrace, and stood before the west door of the hall, and they beat their wings, and it seemed to him that they beckoned him to enter. Then Tuor went up the wide stairs, now half hidden in thrift and campion, and he passed under the mighty lintel, and entered the shadows of the house of Turgon. And he came at last to a high-pillared hall. If great it had appeared from without, now vast and wonderful it seemed to Tuor from within, and for awe he wished not to awake the echoes in its emptiness. Nothing could he see there, save at the eastern end a high seat upon a dais, and softly as he might he paced towards it. But the sound of his feet rang upon the paved floor as the steps of doom, and echoes ran before him along the pillared aisles. As he stood before the great chair in the gloom, and saw that it was hewn of a single stone, and written with strange signs, the sinking sun drew level with a high window under the westward gable, and a shaft of light smote the wall before him, and glittered as it were upon burnished metal. Then Tuor, marvelling, saw that on the wall behind the throne there hung a shield and a great hauberk, and a helm and a longsword in a sheath. The hauberk shone as it were wrought of silver untarnished, and the sunbeam gilded it with sparks of gold. But the shield was of a shape strange to Tuor's eyes, for it was long and tapering, and its field was blue, in the midst of which was wrought an emblem of a white swan's wing. Then Tuor spoke, and his voice rang as a challenge in the roof. "By this token I will take these arms unto myself, and upon myself whatsoever doom they bear." And he lifted down the shield, and found it light and wieldy beyond his guess, for it was wrought, it seemed, of wood, but overlaid by the craft of elven smiths with plates of metal, strong yet thin as foil, whereby it had been preserved from worm and weather. Then Tuor arrayed himself in the hauberk, and set the helm upon his head, and he girt himself with the sword. Black were sheath and belt with clasps of silver. Thus armed he went forth from Turgon's hall, and stood upon the high terraces of Taras in the red light of the sun. None were there to see him, as he gazed westward, gleaming in silver and gold. And he knew not that in that hour he appeared as one of the mighty of the west, and fit to be the father of the kings of men beyond the sea, as it was indeed his doom to be. But in the taking of those arms a change came upon Tuor, son of Huor, and his heart grew great within him. And as he stepped down from the doors, the swans did him reverence. And plucking each a great feather from their wings, they proffered them to him, laying their long necks upon the stone before his feet. And he took the 7 feathers, and set them in the crest of his helm. And straightway the swans arose and flew north in the sunset, and Tuor saw them no more. Now Tuor felt his feet drawn to the sea strand, and he went down by long stairs to a wide shore upon the north side of Taras Ness. And as he went he saw that the sun was sinking low into a great black cloud that came up over the rim of the darkening sea, and it grew cold, and there was a stirring and murmur as of a storm to come. And Tuor stood upon the shore, and the sun was like a smoky fire behind the menace of the sky, and it seemed to him that a great wave rose far off and rolled towards the land, but wonder held him, and he remained there unmoved, and the wave came towards him, and upon it lay a mist of shadow. Then suddenly as it drew near it curled and broke, and rushed forward in long arms of foam. But where it had broken, there stood, dark against the rising storm, a living shape of great height and majesty. Then Tuor bowed in reverence, for it seemed to him that he beheld a mighty king. A tall crown he wore like silver, from which his long hair fell down as foam glimmering in the dusk. And as he cast back the grey mantle that hung about him like a mist, behold, he was clad in a gleaming coat, close fitted as the mail of a mighty fish, and in a kirtle of deep green that flashed and flickered with sea fire as he strode slowly towards the land. In this manner the dweller of the deep, whom the Noldor name Ulmo, Lord of Waters, showed himself to Tuor, son of Huor of the house of Hador beneath Vinyamar. He set no foot upon the shore, but standing knee-deep in the shadowy sea he spoke to Tuor. And then, for the light of his eyes and for the sound of his deep voice that came, as it seemed, from the foundations of the world, fear fell upon Tuor, and he cast himself down upon the sand. "Arise, Tuor, son of Huor," said Ulmo. "Fear not my wrath, though long have I called to thee unheard. And setting out at last thou hast tarried on thy journey hither. In the spring thou shouldst have stood here, but now a fell winter cometh soon from the land of the enemy. Haste thou must learn, and the pleasant road that I designed for thee must be changed, for my counsels have been scorned, and a great evil creeps upon the valley of Sirion, and already a host of foes is come between thee and thy goal." "What then is my goal, Lord?" said Tuor. "That which thy heart hath ever sought," answered Ulmo, "to find Turgon, and look upon the hidden city. For thou art arrayed thus to be my messenger, even in the arms which long ago I decreed for thee. Yet now thou must under shadow pass through peril. Wrap thyself therefore in this cloak, and cast it never aside until thou come to thy journey's end." Then it seemed to Tuor that Ulmo parted his grey mantle, and cast to him a lappet, and as it fell about him it was for him a great cloak, wherein he might wrap himself over all from head to foot. "Thus thou shalt walk under my shadow," said Ulmo, "but tarry no more, for in the lands of Anar and in the fires of Melkor it will not endure. Wilt thou take up my errand?" "I will, Lord," said Tuor. "Then I will set words in thy mouth to say unto Turgon," said Ulmo. "But first I will teach thee, and some things thou shalt hear which no man else hath heard, nay, not even the mighty among the Eldar." And Ulmo spoke to Tuor of Valinor and its darkening, and the exile of the Noldor, and the doom of Mandos, and the hiding of the Blessed Realm. "But behold," said he, "in the armour of fate, as the children of earth name it, there is ever a rift, and in the walls of doom a breach until the full making, which ye call the end. So it shall be while I endure, a secret voice that gainsayeth, and a light where darkness was decreed. Therefore, though in the days of this darkness I seem to oppose the will of my brethren, the lords of the West, that is my part among them, to which I was appointed ere the making of the world. Yet doom is strong, and the shadow of the enemy lengthens, and I am diminished, until in Middle-earth I am become now no more than a secret whisper. The waters that run westward whither, and their springs, are poisoned, and my power withdraws from the land. For elves and men grow blind and deaf to me because of the might of Melkor. And now the curse of Mandos hastens to its fulfilment, and all the works of the Noldor shall perish, and every hope which they build shall crumble. The last hope alone is left, the hope that they have not looked for, and have not prepared. And that hope lieth in thee, for so I have chosen. Then shall Turgon not stand against Morgoth, as all the Eldar yet hope, said Tuor. And what wouldst thou of me, lord, if I come now to Turgon? For though I am indeed willing to do as my father, and stand by that king in his need, yet of little avail shall I be, a mortal man alone, among so many and so valiant of the high folk of the West. If I choose to send thee, Tuor, son of Huor, then believe not that thy one sword is not worth the sending. For the valour of the Edain the elves shall ever remember as the ages lengthen, marvelling that they gave life so freely of which on earth they had so little. But it is not for thy valour only that I send thee, but to bring into the world a hope beyond thy sight, and a light that shall pierce the darkness. And as Ulmo said these things, the mutter of the storm rose to a great cry, and the wind mounted, and the sky grew black, and the mantle of the Lord of Waters streamed out like a flying cloud. Go now, said Ulmo, lest the sea devour thee. For Ossé obeys the will of Mandos, and he is wroth, being a servant of the doom. As thou commandest, said Tuor. But if I escape the doom, what words shall I say unto Turgon? If thou come to him, answered Ulmo, then the words shall arise in thy mind, and thy mouth shall speak as I would. Speak, and fear not, and thereafter do as thy heart and valour lead thee. Hold fast to my mantle, for thus shalt thou be guarded, and I will send one to thee out of the wrath of Ossé, and thus shalt thou be guided. Yea, the last mariner of the last ship that shall seek into the west until the rising of the star. Go now back to the land. Then there was a noise of thunder, and lightning flared over the sea, and Tuor beheld Ulmo standing among the waves as a tower of silver flickering with darting flames. And he cried against the wind, I go, Lord, yet now my heart yearneth rather to the sea. And thereupon Ulmo lifted up a mighty horn, and blew upon it a single great note, to which the roaring of the storm was but a wind-flaw upon a lake. And as he heard that note, and was encompassed by it, and filled with it, it seemed to Tuor that the coasts of Middle-earth vanished, and he surveyed all the waters of the world in a great vision, from the veins of the lands to the mouths of the rivers, and from the strands and estuaries out into the deep. The great sea he saw through its unquiet regions teeming with strange forms, even to its lightless depths, in which, amid the everlasting darkness, there echoed voices terrible to mortal ears. Its measureless plains he surveyed with the swift sight of the Valar, lying windless under the eye of Anar, or glittering under the horned moon, or lifted in hills of wrath that broke upon the shadowy isles, until remote upon the edge of sight, and beyond the count of leagues, he glimpsed a mountain, rising beyond his mind's reach into a shining cloud, and at its feet a long surf glimmering. And even as he strained to hear the sound of those far waves, and to see clearer that distant light, the note ended, and he stood beneath the thunder of the storm, and lightning many-branched rent asunder the heavens above him, and Ulmo was gone, and the sea was in tumult, as the wild waves of Ossé rode against the walls of Nevrast. Then Tuor fled from the fury of the sea, and with labour he won his way back to the high terraces, for the wind drove him against the cliff, and when he came out upon the top it bent him to his knees. Therefore he entered again the dark and empty hall for shelter, and he sat night long in the stone seat of Turgon. The very pillars trembled for the violence of the storm, and it seemed to Tuor that the wind was full of wailing and wild cries. Yet being weary he slept at times, and his sleep was troubled with many dreams, of which naught remained in waking memory save one, a vision of an isle, and in the midst of it was a steep mountain, and behind it the sun went down, and shadows sprang into the sky, but above it there shone a single dazzling star. After this dream Tuor fell into a deep sleep, for before the night was over the tempest passed, driving the black clouds into the east of the world. He awoke at length in the grey light, and arose and left the high seat, and as he went down the dim hall he saw that it was filled with sea-birds driven in by the storm, and he went out as the last stars were fading in the west before the coming day. Then he saw that the great waves in the night had ridden high upon the land, and had cast their crests above the cliff-tops, and weed and shingle drift were flung even upon the terraces before the doors. And Tuor looked down from the lowest terrace, and saw, leaning against its wall among the stones and the sea-wrack, an elf, clad in a grey cloak sodden with the sea. Silent he sat, gazing beyond the ruin of the beaches out over the long ridges of the waves. All was still, and there was no sound save the roaring of the surf below. As Tuor stood and looked at the silent grey figure, he remembered the words of Ulmo, and a name untaught came to his lips, and he called aloud, "Welcome, Voronwe! I await you." Then the elf turned and looked up, and Tuor met the piercing glance of his sea-grey eyes, and knew that he was of the high folk of the Noldor. But fear and wonder grew in his gaze as he saw Tuor standing high upon the wall above him, clad in his great cloak like a shadow out of which the elven mail gleamed upon his breast. A moment thus they stayed, each searching the face of the other, and then the elf stood up and bowed low before Tuor's feet. "Who are you, Lord?" he said. "Long have I laboured in the unrelenting sea. Tell me, have great tidings befallen since I walked the land? Is the shadow overthrown? Have the hidden people come forth?" "Nay," Tuor answered. "The shadow lengthens, and the hidden remain hid." Then Voronwe looked at him long in silence. "But who are you?" he asked again. "For many years ago my people left this land, and none have dwelt here since. And now I perceive that despite your raiment you are not of them, as I thought, but are of the kindred of men." "I am," said Tuor. "And are you not the last mariner of the last ship that sought the west from the havens of Círdan?" "I am," said the elf. "Voronwe, son of Oranwe, am I. But how you know my name and fate I understand not." "I know, for the Lord of Waters spoke to me yestereve," answered Tuor, "and he said that he would save you from the wrath of Ossé, and send you hither to be my guide." Then in fear and wonder Voronwe cried, You have spoken with Ulmo the Mighty? Then great indeed must be your worth and doom. But whither should I guide you, Lord? For surely a king of men you must be, and many must wait upon your word. Nay, I am an escaped thrall, said Tuor, and I am an outlaw alone in an empty land. But I have an errand to Turgon, the hidden king. Know you by what road I should find him? Many are outlaw and thrall in these days who were not born so, answered Voronwë. A lord of men by right you are, I deem. But were you the highest of all your folk, no right would you have to seek Turgon, and vain would be your quest. For even were I to lead you to his gates, you could not enter in. I do not bid you to lead me further than the gate, said Tuor. There doom shall strive with the counsel of Ulmo, and if Turgon will not receive me, then my errand will be ended and doom shall prevail. But as for my right to seek Turgon, I am Tuor, son of Huor and kin to Húrin, whose names Turgon will not forget. And I seek also by the command of Ulmo. Will Turgon forget that which he spoke to him of old? Remember that the last hope of the Noldor cometh from the sea? Or again, when peril is nigh, one shall come from Nevrast to warn thee. I am he that should come, and I am arrayed thus in the gear that was prepared for me. Tuor marvelled to hear himself speak so, for the words of Ulmo to Turgon at his going from Nevrast were not known to him before, nor to any save the hidden people. Therefore the more amazed was Voronwë, but he turned away and looked toward the sea, and he sighed. Alas, he said, I wish never again to return, and often have I vowed in the deeps of the sea that if I ever set foot on land again, I would dwell at rest far from the shadow in the north, or by the havens of Círdan, or maybe in the fair fields of Nan Tathrin, where the spring is sweeter than the heart's desire. But if evil has grown while I have wandered, and the last peril approaches them, then I must go to my people. He turned back to Tuor. I will lead you to the hidden gates, he said, for the wise will not gainsay the counsels of Ulmo. Then we will go together, as we are counselled, said Tuor. But mourn not, Voronwë, for my heart says to you that far from the shadow your long road shall lead you, and your hope shall return to the sea. And yours also, said Voronwë. But now we must leave it, and go in haste. Yea, said Tuor. But whither will you lead me, and how far? Shall we not first take thought how we may fare in the wild, or if the way be long, how pass the harbourless winter? But Voronwë would answer nothing clearly concerning the road. You know the strength of men, he said. As for me, I am of the Noldor, and long must be the hunger and cold the winter that shall slay the kin of those who passed the grinding ice. Yet how think you that we could labour countless days in the salt wastes of the sea? Or have you not heard of the waybread of the elves? And I keep still that which all mariners hold until the last. Then he showed beneath his cloak a sealed wallet clasped upon his belt. No water nor weather will harm it while it is sealed. But we must husband it until great need, and doubtless an outlaw and hunter may find other food ere the year worsens. Maybe, said Tuor, but not in all lands is it safe to hunt, be the game never so plentiful, and hunters tarry on the road. Now Tuor and Voronwë made ready to depart. Tuor took with him the small bow and arrows that he had brought, beside the gear that he had taken from the hall, but his spear, upon which his name was written in the elven runes of the north, he set upon the wall in token that he had passed. No arms had Voronwë, save a short sword only. Before the day was broad, they left the ancient dwelling of Turgon, and Voronwë led Tuor about, westward of the steep slopes of Taras, and across the great cape. There once the road from Nevrast to Brithombar had passed, that now was but a green track between old turf-clad dykes. So they came into Beleriand, and the north region of the Falas, and turning eastward they sought the dark eaves of Ered-Wethrin, and there they lay hid and rested until day had waned to dusk. For though the ancient dwellings of the Falathrim, Brithombar and Eglarest, were still far distant, orcs now dwelt there, and all the land was infested by the spies of Morgoth. He feared the ships of Círdan that would come at times raiding to the shores, and join with the forays sent forth from Nargothrond. Now as they sat shrouded in their cloaks as shadows under the hills, Tuor and Voronwë spoke much together, and Tuor questioned Voronwë concerning Turgon. But Voronwë would tell little of such matters, and spoke rather of the dwellings upon the Isle of Balar, and of the Lisgarth, the land of reeds at the mouths of Sirion. There now the numbers of the Eldar increase, he said, for evermore flee thither of either kin from the fear of Morgoth, weary of war. But I forsook not my people of my own choice. For after the Bragolach and the breaking of the siege of Angband, doubt first came into Turgon's heart that Morgoth might prove too strong. In that year he sent out the first of his folk that passed his gates from within, a few only, upon a secret errand. They went down Sirion to the shores about the mouths, and there built ships, but it availed them nothing, save to come to the great Isle of Balar and there establish lonely dwellings far from the reach of Morgoth. For the Noldor have not the art of building ships that will long endure the waves of Belegea the Great. But when later Turgon heard of the ravaging of the Falas and the sack of the ancient havens of the shipwrights that lie away there before us, and it was told that Círdan had saved a remnant of his people and sailed away south to the Bay of Balar, then he sent out messengers anew. That was but a little while ago, yet it seems in memory the longest portion of my life. For I was one of those that he sent, being young in years among the Eldar. I was born here in Middle-earth in the land of Nevrast. My mother was of the grey elves of the Falas, and akin to Círdan himself. There was much mingling of the peoples in Nevrast in the first days of Turgon's kingship. And I have the sea heart of my mother's people. Therefore I was among the chosen, since our errand was to Círdan to seek his aid in our shipbuilding, that some message and prayer for aid might come to the lords of the West ere all was lost. But I tarried on the way, for I had seen little of the lands of Middle-earth, and we came to Nan Tathrin in the spring of the year. Lovely to heart's enchantment is that land, Tuor, as you shall find, if ever your feet go upon the southward roads down Sirion. There is the cure of all sea-longing, save for those whom doom will not release. There Ulmo is but the servant of Yavanna, and the earth has brought to life a wealth of fair things that is beyond the thought of hearts in the hard hills of the north. In that land Narog joins Sirion, and they haste no more, but flow broad and quiet through living meads. And all about the shining river are flag-lilies like a blossoming forest, and the grass is filled with flowers like gems, like bells, like flames of red and gold, like a waste of many-coloured stars in a firmament of green. Yet fairest of all are the willows of Nan Tathrin, pale green or silver in the wind, and the rustle of their innumerable leaves is a spell of music. Day and night would flicker by uncounted, while still I stood knee-deep in grass and listened. There I was enchanted, and forgot the sea in my heart. There I wandered, naming new flowers, or lay a dream amid the singing of the birds and the humming of bees and flies. And there I might still dwell in delight, forsaking all my kin, whether the ships of the Teleri or the swords of the Noldor. But my doom would not so. Or the Lord of Waters himself, may be, for he was strong in that land. Thus it came into my heart to make a raft of willow boughs and move upon the bright bosom of Sirion. And so I did, and so I was taken. For on a day, as I was in the midst of the river, a sudden wind came and caught me, and bore me away out of the land of willows down to the sea. Thus I came last of the messengers to Círdan, and of the 7 ships that he built at Turgon's asking, all but one were then full wrought, and one by one they set sail into the west, and none yet has ever returned, nor has any news of them been heard. But the salt air of the sea now stirred anew the heart of my mother's kin within me, and I rejoiced in the waves, learning all ship-lore, as were it already stored in the mind. So when the last ship, and the greatest, was made ready, I was eager to be gone, saying within my thought, if the words of the Noldor be true, then in the west there are meads with which the land of willows cannot compare. There is no withering, nor any end of spring, and perhaps even I, Veronwë, may come thither. And at the worst, to wander on the waters is better far than the shadow in the north. And I feared not, for the ships of the Teleri no water may drown. But the great sea is terrible, Tuor, son of Huor, and it hates the Noldor, for it works the doom of the Valar. Worse things it holds than to sink into the abyss and so perish. Loathing and loneliness and madness, terror of wind and tumult, and silence, and shadows where all hope is lost and all living shapes pass away. And many shores evil and strange it washes, and many islands of danger and fear infest it. I will not darken your heart, son of Middle-earth, with the tale of my labour 7 years in the great sea from the north even into the south, but never to the west, for that is shut against us. At the last, in black despair, weary of all the world, we turned and fled from the doom that so long had spared us, only to strike us more cruelly. For even as we descried a mountain from afar, and I cried, Lo, there is Taras, the land of my birth, the wind awoke, and great clouds thunder-laden came up from the west. Then the waves hunted us like living things filled with malice, and the lightning smote us, and when we were broken down to a helpless hull, the seas leaped upon us in fury. But as you see, I was spared, for it seemed to me that there came a wave, greater and yet calmer than all the others, and it took me and lifted me from the ship, and bore me high upon its shoulders, and rolling to the land it cast me upon the turf, and then drained away, pouring back over the cliff in a great waterfall. There but 1 hour had I sat when you came upon me, still dazed by the sea, and still I feel the fear of it, and the bitter loss of all my friends that went with me so long and so far, beyond the sight of mortal lands. Veronwë sighed, and spoke then softly as if to himself. But very bright were the stars upon the margin of the world, when at times the clouds about the west were drawn aside. Yet whether we saw only clouds still more remote, or glimpsed indeed, as some held, the mountains of the Pelori about the lost strands of our long home, I know not. Far, far away they stand, and none from mortal lands shall come there ever again, I deem. Then Veronwë fell silent, for night had come, and the stars shone white and cold. Soon after, Tuor and Veronwë arose and turned their backs toward the sea, and set out upon their long journey in the dark, of which there is little to tell, for the shadow of Ulmo was on Tuor, and none saw them pass, by wood or stone, by field or fen, between the setting and the rising of the sun. But ever warily they went, shunning the night-eyed hunters of Morgoth, and forsaking the trodden ways of elves and men. Veronwë chose their path, and Tuor followed. He asked no vain questions, but noted well that they went ever eastward along the march of the rising mountains, and turned never southward, at which he wondered, for he believed, as did well nigh all elves and men, that Turgon dwelt far from the battles of the north. Slow was their going by twilight or by night in the pathless wilds, and the fell winter came down swiftly from the realm of Morgoth. Despite the shelter of the hills, the winds were strong and bitter, and soon the snow lay deep upon the heights, or whirled through the passes, and fell upon the woods of Nuath, ere the full shedding of their withered leaves. Thus, though they set out before the middle of Narqueliae, the Hissime came in with biting frost, even as they drew nigh to the sources of Narog. There, at the end of a weary night in the grey of dawn, they halted, and Voronwë was dismayed, looking about him in grief and fear. Where once the fair pool of Ivrin had lain in its great stone basin carved by falling waters, and all about it had been a tree-clad hollow under the hills, now he saw a land defiled and desolate. The trees were burned or uprooted, and the stone marges of the pool were broken, so that the waters of Ivrin strayed and wrought a great barren marsh amid the ruin. All now was but a welter of frozen mire, and a reek of decay lay like a foul mist upon the ground. "Alas, has the evil come even here?" Voronwë cried. "Once far from the threat of Angband was this place, but ever the fingers of Morgoth grope further." "It is even as Ulmo spoke to me," said Tuor. "The springs are poisoned, and my power withdraws from the waters of the land." "Yet," said Voronwë, "a malice has been here with strength greater than that of orcs. Fear lingers in this place." And he searched about the edges of the mire, until suddenly he stood still and cried again, "Yea, a great evil!" And he beckoned to Tuor, and Tuor coming saw a slot like a huge furrow that passed away southward, and at either side, now blurred, now sealed hard and clear by frost, the marks of great clawed feet. "See," said Voronwë, and his face was pale with dread and loathing. "Here not long since was the great worm of Angband, most fell of all the creatures of the enemy. Late already is our errand to Turgon. There is need of haste." Even as he spoke thus, they heard a cry in the woods, and they stood still as grey stones, listening. But the voice was a fair voice, though filled with grief, and it seemed that it called ever upon a name, as one that searches for another who is lost. And as they waited, one came through the trees, and they saw that he was a tall man, armed, clad in black, with a long sword drawn, and they wondered, for the blade of the sword also was black, but the edges shone bright and cold. Woe was graven in his face, and when he beheld the ruin of Ivrin, he cried aloud in grief, saying, "Ivrin, Fail Ivrin, Gwyndor and Beleg, here once I was healed, but now never shall I drink the draught of peace again." Then he went swiftly away towards the north, as one in pursuit or on an errand of great haste, and they heard him cry, "Fail Ivrin, Finduilas," until his voice died away in the woods. But they knew not that Nargothrond had fallen, and this was Turin, son of Hurin the Black Sword. Thus only for a moment, and never again, did the paths of those kinsmen, Turin and Tuor, draw together. When the Black Sword had passed, Tuor and Voronwë held on their way for a while, though day had come. For the memory of his grief was heavy upon them, and they could not endure to remain beside the defilement of Ivrin. But before long they sought a hiding place, for all the land was filled now with a foreboding of evil. They slept little and uneasily, and as the day wore it grew dark and a great snow fell, and with the night came a grinding frost. Thereafter the snow and ice relented not at all, and for 5 months the fell winter, long remembered, held the north in bonds. Now Tuor and Voronwe were tormented by the cold, and feared to be revealed by the snow to hunting enemies, or to fall into hidden dangers treacherously cloaked. 9 days they held on, ever slower and more painfully, and Voronwe turned somewhat north until they crossed the 3 well streams of Teiglin, and then he bore eastward again, leaving the mountains, and went warily until they passed Glithowy and came to the stream of Malduin, and it was frozen black. Then Tuor said to Voronwe, "Fell is this frost, and death draws near to me, if not to you." For they were now in evil case. It was long since they had found any food in the wild, and the waybread was dwindling, and they were cold and weary. "Ill is it to be trapped between the doom of the Valar and the malice of the enemy," said Voronwe. "Have I escaped the mouths of the sea but to lie under the snow?" But Tuor said, "How far is now to go? For at last, Voronwe, you must forego your secrecy with me. Do you lead me straight, and whither? For if I must spend my last strength, I would know to what that may avail." "I have led you as straight as I safely might," answered Voronwe. "Know then now that Turgon dwells still in the north of the land of the Eldar, though that is believed by few. Already we draw nigh to him, yet there are many leagues still to go, even as a bird might fly, and for us Sirion is yet to cross, and great evil, may be, lies between. For we must come soon to the highway that ran of old down from the Minas of King Finrod to Nargothrond. There the servants of the enemy will walk and watch." "I counted myself the hardiest of men," said Tuor, "and I have endured many winters' woe in the mountains. But I had a cave at my back and fire then, and I doubt now my strength to go much further thus hungry through the fell weather. But let us go on as far as we may before hope fails." "No other choice have we," said Voronwe, "unless it be to lay us down here and seek the snow-sleep." Therefore all through that bitter day they toiled on, deeming the peril of foes less than the winter. But ever as they went they found less snow, for they were now going southward again down into the vale of Sirion, and the mountains of Dorlomin were left far behind. In the deepening dusk they came to the highway at the bottom of a tall wooded bank. Suddenly they were aware of voices, and looking out warily from the trees they saw a red light below. A company of orcs was encamped in the midst of the road, huddled about a large wood fire. "Gurthan Glamhoth, death to the orcs," Tuor muttered. "Now the sword shall come from under the cloak. I will risk death for mastery of that fire, and even the meat of orcs would be a prize." "Nay," said Voronwe, "on this quest only the cloak will serve. You must forego the fire, or else forego Turgon. This band is not alone in the wild. Cannot your mortal sight see the far flame of other posts to the north and to the south? A tumult will bring a host upon us. Hearken to me, Tuor. It is against the law of the hidden kingdom that any should approach the gates with foes at their heels, and that law I will not break, neither for Ulmo's bidding nor for death. Rouse the orcs, and I leave you." "Then let them be," said Tuor. "But may I live yet to see the day when I need not sneak aside from a handful of orcs like a cowed dog." "Come then," said Voronwe. "Debate no more, or they will scent us. Follow me." He crept then away through the trees, southward down the wind, until they were midway between that orc fire and the next upon the road. There he stood a long while, listening. "I hear none moving on the road," he said, "but we know not what may be lurking in the shadows." He peered forward into the gloom and shuddered. "The air is evil," he muttered. "Alas, yonder lies the land of our quest and hope of life, but death walks between." "Death is all about us," said Tuor, "but I have strength left only for the shortest road. Here I must cross or perish. I will trust to the mantle of Ulmo, and you also it shall cover. Now I will lead." So saying, he stole to the border of the road. Then, clasping Voronway close, he cast about them both the folds of the grey cloak of the Lord of Waters, and stepped forth. All was still. The cold wind sighed as it swept down the ancient road. Then suddenly it too fell silent. In the pause, Tuor felt a change in the air, as if the breath from the land of Morgoth had failed a while. And faint as a memory of the sea came a breeze from the west. As a grey mist on the wind, they passed over the stony street, and entered a thicket on its eastern brink. All at once from near at hand there came a wild cry, and many others along the borders of the road answered it. A harsh horn blared, and there was the sound of running feet. But Tuor held on. He had learned enough of the tongue of the orcs in his captivity to know the meaning of those cries. The watchers had scented them and heard them, but they were not seen. The hunt was out. Desperately he stumbled and crept forward with Voronway at his side, up a long slope deep in whin and whortleberry among knots of rowan and low birch. At the top of the ridge they halted, listening to the shouts behind and the crashing of the orcs in the undergrowth below. Beside them was a boulder that reared its head out of a tangle of heath and brambles, and beneath it was such a lair as a hunted beast might seek and hope there to escape pursuit, or at the least, with its back to stone, to sell its life dearly. Down into the dark shadow Tuor drew Voronway, and side by side under the grey cloak they lay and panted like tired foxes. No word they spoke. All their heed was in their ears. The cries of the hunters grew fainter, for the orcs thrust never deep into the wild lands at either hand, but swept rather down and up the road. They recked little of stray fugitives, but spies they feared, and the scouts of armed foes. For Morgoth had set a guard on the highway, not to ensnare Tuor and Voronway, of whom as yet he knew nothing, nor any coming from the west, but to watch for the black sword, lest he should escape and pursue the captives of Nargothrond, bringing help, it might be, out of Doriath. The night passed, and the brooding silence lay again upon the empty lands. Weary and spent, Tuor slept beneath Ulmo's cloak. But Voronway crept forth and stood like a stone, silent, unmoving, piercing the shadows with his elvish eyes. At the break of day he woke Tuor, and he, creeping out, saw that the weather had indeed for a time relented, and the black clouds were rolled aside. There was a red dawn, and he could see far before him the tops of strange mountains glinting against the eastern fire. Then Voronway said in a low voice, "Allay, ered en Ecoriath, ered embar nin." The encircling mountains, the mountains of my home. For he knew that he looked on the encircling mountains and the walls of the realm of Turgon. Below them, eastward in a deep and shadowy vale, lay Sirion the fair, renowned in song, and beyond, wrapped in mist, a grey land climbed from the river to the broken hills at the mountain's feet. "Yonder lies Dimbar," said Voronway. "Would we were there, for there our foes seldom dare to walk, or so it was while the power of Ulmo was strong in Sirion. But all may now be changed, save the peril of the river. It is already deep and swift, and even for the Eldar dangerous to cross. But I have led you well, for there gleams the ford of Brithiach, yet a little southward, where the east road that of old ran all the way from Taras in the west made the passage of the river. None now dare to use it save in desperate need, neither elf nor man nor orc, since that road leads to Dungortheb, and the land of dread between the Gorgoroth and the girdle of Melian. And long since has it faded into the wild, or dwindled to a track among weeds and trailing thorns." Then Tuor looked as Voronway pointed, and far away he caught the glimmer as of open waters under the brief light of dawn. But beyond loomed a darkness, where the great forest of Brethil climbed away southward into a distant highland. Now warily they made their way down the valley side, until at last they came to the ancient road descending from the waymeet on the borders of Brethil, where it crossed the highway from Nargothrond. Then Tuor saw that they were come close to Sirion. The banks of its deep channel fell away in that place, and its waters, choked by a great waste of stones, were spread out into broad shallows, full of the murmur of fretting streams. Then, after a little, the river gathered together again, and delving a new bed, flowed away toward the forest, and far off vanished into a deep mist that his eye could not pierce. For there lay, though he knew it not, the north march of Doriath, within the shadow of the girdle of Melian. At once Tuor would hasten to the ford, but Voronwë restrained him, saying, "Over the Brithiach we may not go in open day, nor while any doubt of pursuit remains." "Then shall we sit here and rot?" said Tuor. "For such doubt will remain while the realm of Morgoth endures. Come, under the shadow of the cloak of Ulmo we must go forward." Still Voronwë hesitated, and looked back westward, but the track behind was deserted, and all about was quiet save for the rush of the waters. He looked up, and the sky was grey and empty, for not even a bird was moving. Then suddenly his face brightened with joy, and he cried aloud, "It is well. The Brithiach is guarded still by the enemies of the enemy. The orcs will not follow us here, and under the cloak we may pass now without more doubt." "What new thing have you seen?" said Tuor. "Short is the sight of mortal men," said Voronwë. "I see the eagles of the Chrysaegrim, and they are coming hither. Watch a while." Then Tuor stood at gaze, and soon high in the air he saw 3 shapes beating on strong wings down from the distant mountain peaks, now wreathed again in cloud. Slowly they descended in great circles, and then stooped suddenly upon the wayfarers. But before Voronwë could call to them, they turned with a wide sweep and rush, and flew northward along the line of the river. "Now let us go," said Voronwë. "If there be any orc nearby, he will lie cowering nose to ground until the eagles have gone far away." Swiftly down a long slope they hastened, and passed over the Brithiach, walking often dry-foot upon shelves of shingle, or wading in the shoals no more than knee-deep. The water was clear and very cold, and there was ice upon the shallow pools where the wandering streams had lost their way among the stones. But never, not even in the fell winter of the fall of Nargothrond, could the deadly breath of the north freeze the main flood of Sirion. On the far side of the ford they came to a gully, as it were the bed of an old stream, in which no water now flowed. Yet once, it seemed, a torrent had cloven its deep channel, coming down from the north out of the mountains of the Echoriath, and bearing thence all the stones of the Brithiach down into Sirion. "At last, beyond hope we find it," cried Voronwë. "See, here is the mouth of the dry river, and that is the road we must take." Then they passed into the gully, and as it turned north and the slopes of the land went steeply up, so its sides rose on either hand, and Tuor stumbled in the dim light among the stones with which its rough bed was strewn. "If this is a road," he said, "it is an evil one for the weary." "Yet it is the road to Turgon," said Voronwë. "Then the more do I marvel," said Tuor, "that its entrance lies open and unguarded. I had looked to find a great gate and strength of guard." "That you shall yet see," said Voronwë. "This is but the approach. A road, I named it, yet upon it none have passed for more than 300 years, save messengers few and secret, and all the craft of the Noldor has been expended to conceal it, since the hidden people entered in. Does it lie open? Would you have known it, if you had not had one of the hidden kingdom for a guide? Or would you have guessed it to be but the work of the weathers and the waters of the wilderness? And are there not the eagles, as you have seen? They are the folk of Thorondor, who dwelt once even on Thangorodrim, ere Morgoth grew so mighty. and dwell now in the mountains of Turgon since the fall of Fingolfin. They alone, save the Noldor, know the hidden kingdom and guard the skies above it, though as yet no servant of the enemy has dared to fly into the high airs. And they bring much news to the king of all that moves in the lands without. Had we been orcs, doubt not that we should have been seized, and cast from a great height upon the pitiless rocks. I doubt it not, said Tuor. But it comes into my mind to wonder also whether news will now not come to Turgon of our approach swifter than we. And if that be good or ill, you alone can say. Neither good nor ill, said Voronwë. For we cannot pass the guarded gate unmarked, be we looked for or no. And if we come there, the guards will need no report that we are not orcs. But to pass, we shall need a greater plea than that. For you do not guess, Tuor, the peril that we then shall face. Blame me not as one unwarned for what may then betide. May the power of the Lord of Waters be shown indeed. For in that hope alone have I been willing to guide you, and if it fails, then more surely shall we die than by all the perils of wild and winter. But Tuor said, Forebode no more. Death in the wild is certain, and death at the gate is yet in doubt to me for all your words. Lead me still on. Many miles they toiled on in the stones of the dry river, until they could go no further, and the evening brought darkness into the deep cleft. They climbed out then onto the east bank, and they had now come into the tumbled hills that lay at the feet of the mountains. And looking up, Tuor saw that they towered up in a fashion other than that of any mountains that he had seen. For their sides were like sheer walls, piled each one above and behind the lower, as were they great towers of many-storied precipices. But the day had waned, and all the lands were grey and misty, and the vale of Sirion was shrouded in shadow. Then Voronwë led him to a shallow cave in a hillside that looked out over the lonely slopes of Dimbar, and they crept within, and there they lay hid, and they ate their last crumbs of food, and were cold and weary, but slept not. Thus did Tuor and Voronwë come in the dusk of the 18th day of Hisime, the 37th of their journey, to the towers of the Ecoriath and the threshold of Turgon, and by the power of Ulmo escaped both the doom and the malice. When the first glimmer of day filtered grey amid the mists of Dimbar, they crept back into the dry river, and soon after its course turned eastward, winding up to the very walls of the mountains, and straight before them there loomed a great precipice, rising sheer and sudden from a steep slope upon which grew a tangled thicket of thorn trees. Into this thicket the stony channel entered, and there it was still dark as night, and they halted, for the thorns grew far down the sides of the gully, and their lacing branches were a dense roof above it, so low that often Tuor and Voronwë must crawl under like beasts stealing back to their lair. But at last, as with great labour they came to the very foot of the cliff, they found an opening, as it were the mouth of a tunnel worn in the hard rock by waters flowing from the heart of the mountains. They entered, and within there was no light, but Voronwë went steadily forward, while Tuor followed with his hand upon his shoulder, bending a little, for the roof was low. Thus for a time they went on blindly, step by step, until presently they felt the ground beneath their feet had become level and free from loose stones. Then they halted and breathed deeply, as they stood listening. The air seemed fresh and wholesome, and they were aware of a great space around and above them, but all was silent, and not even the drip of water could be heard. It seemed to Tuor that Voronwë was troubled and in doubt, and he whispered, "Where, then, is the guarded gate? Or have we indeed now passed it?" "Nay," said Voronwë, "yet I wonder, for it is strange that any incomer should creep thus far unchallenged. I fear some stroke in the dark." But their whispers aroused the sleeping echoes, and they were enlarged and multiplied, and ran in the roof and the unseen walls, hissing and murmuring as the sound of many stealthy voices. And even as the echoes died in the stone, Tuor heard out of the darkness a voice speak in the elven tongues, first in the high speech of the Noldor, which he knew not, and then in the tongue of Beleriand, though in a manner somewhat strange to his ears, as of a people long sundered from their kin. "Stand," it said, "stir not, or you will die, be you foes or friends."
"We are friends," said Veronwë.
"Then do as we bid," said the voice.
The echo of their voices rolled into silence.
Veronwë and Tuor stood still, and it seemed to Tuor that many slow minutes passed, and a fear was in his heart such as no other peril of his road had brought. Then there came the beat of feet, growing to a tramping loud as the march of trolls in that hollow place. Suddenly an elven lantern was unhooded, and its bright ray was turned upon Veronwë before him, but nothing else could Tuor see save a dazzling star in the darkness, and he knew that while that beam was upon him, he could not move, neither to flee nor to run forward. For a moment they were held thus in the eye of the light, and then the voice spoke again, saying, "Show your faces." And Veronwë cast back his hood, and his face shone in the ray, hard and clear, as if graven in stone, and Tuor marvelled to see its beauty. Then he spoke proudly, saying, "Know you not whom you see? I am Veronwë, son of Oranwë of the house of Fingolfin. Or am I forgotten in my own land after a few years? Far beyond the thought of Middle-earth I have wandered, yet I remember your voice, Elemachiel." "Then Veronwë will remember also the laws of his land," said the voice. "Since by command he went forth, he has the right to return, but not to lead hither any stranger. By that deed his right is void, and he must be led as a prisoner to the king's judgment. As for the stranger, he shall be slain or held captive at the judgment of the guard. Lead him hither that I may judge." Then Veronwë led Tuor towards the light, and as they drew near, many Noldor, mail-clad and armed, stepped forward out of the darkness and surrounded them with drawn swords. And Elemachiel, captain of the guard, who bore the bright lamp, looked long and closely at them. "This is strange in you, Veronwë," he said. "We were long friends. Why then would you set me thus cruelly between the law and my friendship? If you had led hither, unbidden, one of the other houses of the Noldor, that were enough. But you have brought to knowledge of the way a mortal man, for by his eyes I perceive his kin. Yet free can he never again go, knowing the secret. And as one of alien kin that has dared to enter, I should slay him, even though he be your friend and dear to you. In the wide lands without Elemachiel, many strange things may befall one, and tasks unlooked for be laid on one," Veronwë answered. "Other shall the wanderer return than as he set forth. What I have done under command greater than the law of the guard. The king alone should judge me, and him that comes with me." Then Tuor spoke, and feared no longer. "I come with Veronwë, son of Oranwë, because he was appointed to be my guide by the Lord of Waters. To this end was he delivered from the wrath of the sea and the doom of the Valar. For I bear from Ulmo an errand to the son of Fingolfin, and to him will I speak it." Thereat Elemachiel looked in wonder upon Tuor. "Who then are you?" he said. "And whence come you?" "I am Tuor, son of Huor of the house of Hador and the kindred of Hurin. And these names, I am told, are not unknown in the hidden kingdom. From Nevrast I have come through many perils to seek it." "From Nevrast?" said Elemachiel. "It is said that none dwell there since our people departed." "It is said truly," answered Tuor. "Empty and cold stand the courts of Vinyamar. Yet thence I come. Bring me now to him that built those halls of old." "In matters so great judgment is not mine," said Alamachiel. "Therefore I will lead you to the light where more may be revealed, and I will deliver you to the warden of the great gate." Then he spoke in command, and Tuor and Veronwe were set between tall guards, 2 before and 3 behind them. And their captain led them from the cavern of the outer guard, and they passed, as it seemed, into a straight passage, and there walked long upon a level floor until a pale light gleamed ahead. Thus they came at length to a wide arch with tall pillars upon either hand, hewn in the rock, and between hung a great portcullis of crossed wooden bars, marvellously carved and studded with nails of iron. Alamachiel touched it, and it rose silently, and they passed through. And Tuor saw that they stood at the end of a ravine, the like of which he had never before beheld or imagined in his thought, long though he had walked in the wild mountains of the north. For beside the Orfalk Echor, Cirith Niniach was but a groove in the rock. Here the hands of the Valar themselves, in ancient wars of the world's beginning, had wrested the great mountains asunder, and the sides of the rift were sheer as if axe-cloven, and they towered up to heights unguessable. There far aloft ran a ribbon of sky, and against its deep blue stood black peaks and jagged pinnacles, remote but hard, cruel as spears. Too high were those mighty walls for the winter sun to overlook, and though it was now full morning, faint stars glimmered above the mountain tops, and down below all was dim, but for the pale light of lamps set beside the climbing road. For the floor of the ravine sloped steeply up, eastward, and upon the left hand Tuor saw beside the stream bed a wide way, laid and paved with stone, winding upward till it vanished into shadow. "You have passed the first gate, the gate of wood," said Alamachiel. "There lies the way. We must hasten." How far that deep road ran, Tuor could not guess, and as he stared onward a great weariness came upon him like a cloud. A chill wind hissed over the faces of the stones, and he drew his cloak about him. "Cold blows the wind from the hidden kingdom," he said. "Yea, indeed," said Veronwe. "To a stranger it might seem that pride has made the servants of Turgon pitiless. Long and hard seem the leagues of the 7 gates to the hungry and way-worn. If our law were less stern, long ago guile and hatred would have entered and destroyed us. That you know well," said Alamachiel. "But we are not pitiless. Here there is no food, and the stranger may not go back through a gate that he has passed. Endure then a little, and at the 2nd gate you shall be eased." "It is well," said Tuor, and he went forward as he was bidden. After a little he turned and saw that Alamachiel alone followed with Veronwe. "There is no need more of guards," said Alamachiel, reading his thought. "From the Orfalk there is no escape for elf or man, and no returning." Thus they went on up the steep way, sometimes by long stairs, sometimes by winding slopes, under the daunting shadow of the cliff, until some half-league from the wooden gate, Tuor saw that the way was barred by a great wall built across the ravine from side to side, with stout towers of stone at either hand. In the wall was a great archway above the road, but it seemed that masons had blocked it with a single mighty stone. As they drew near, its dark and polished face gleamed in the light of a white lamp that hung above the midst of the arch. "Here stands the 2nd gate, the gate of stone," said Alamachiel, and going up to it he thrust lightly upon it. It turned upon an unseen pivot until its edge was towards them, and the way was open upon either side, and they passed through into a court where stood many armed guards clad in grey. No word was spoken, but Alamachiel led his charges to a chamber beneath the northern tower, and there food and wine was brought to them, and they were permitted to rest a while. "Scant may the fare seem," said Alamachiel to Tuor, "but if your claim be proved, hereafter it shall richly be amended." "It is enough," said Tuor. Faint were the heart that needed better healing. And indeed such refreshment did he find in the drink and food of the Noldor, that soon he was eager to go on. After a little space they came to a wall yet higher and stronger than before, and in it was set the third gate, the Gate of Bronze, a great twofold door hung with shields and plates of bronze, wherein were wrought many figures and strange signs. Upon the wall above its lintel were 3 square towers, roofed and clad with copper, that by some device of smithcraft were ever bright, and gleamed as fire in the rays of the red lamps ranged like torches along the wall. Again silently they passed the gate, and saw in the court beyond a yet greater company of guards in mail that glowed like dull fire, and the blades of their axes were red. Of the kindred of the Sindar of Nevrast, for the most part, were those that held this gate. Now they came to the most toilsome road, for in the midst of the Orfalch the slope was at the steepest, and as they climbed, Tuor saw the mightiest of the walls looming dark above him. Thus, at last, they drew near the 4th gate, the Gate of Rithon Iron. High and black was the wall, and lit with no lamps. 4 towers of iron stood upon it, and between the 2 inner towers was set an image of a great eagle wrought in iron, even the likeness of King Thorondor himself, as he would alight upon a mountain from the high airs. But as Tuor stood before the gate, it seemed to his wonder that he was looking through boughs and stems of imperishable trees into a pale glade of the moon. For a light came through the traceries of the gate, which were wrought and hammered into the shapes of trees with writhing roots and woven branches, laden with leaves and flowers. And as he passed through, he saw how this could be, for the wall was of great thickness, and there was not 1 grille, but 3 in line, so set that to one who approached in the middle of the way, each formed part of the device. But the light beyond was the light of day. For they had climbed now to a great height above the lowlands where they began, and beyond the iron gate the road ran almost level. Moreover, they had passed the crown and heart of the Ecoriath, and the mountain towers now fell swiftly down towards the inner hills, and the ravine opened wider, and its sides became less sheer. Its long shoulders were mantled with white snow, and the light of the skies snow-mirrored came white as moonlight through a glimmering mist that filled the air. Now they passed through the lines of the iron guards that stood behind the gate. Black were their mantles and their mail and long shields, and their faces were masked with visors bearing an eagle's beak. Then Elamachiel went before them, and they followed him into the pale light. And Tuor saw beside the way a sward of grass, where like stars bloomed the white flowers of Uilos, the evermind that knows no season and withers not. And thus, in wonder and lightening of heart, he was brought to the Gate of Silver. The wall of the 5th gate was built of white marble, and was low and broad, and its parapet was a trellis of silver between 5 great globes of marble, and there stood many archers robed in white. The gate was in shape as 3 parts of a circle, and wrought of silver and pearl of Nevrast in likeness of the moon. But above the gate, upon the midmost globe, stood an image of the white tree Telperion, wrought of silver and malachite, with flowers made of great pearls of Balar. And beyond the gate, in a wide court paved with marble, green and white, stood archers in silver mail and white-crested helms, 100 upon either hand. Then Elamachiel led Tuor and Veronwe through their silent ranks, and they entered upon a long white road that ran straight towards the 6th gate. And as they went, the grass sward became wider, and among the white stars of Uilos there opened many small flowers like eyes of gold. So they came to the Golden Gate, the last of the ancient gates of Turgon that were wrought before the Nirnaeth. And it was much like the Gate of Silver, save that the wall was built of yellow marble, and the globes and parapet were of red gold, and there were 6 globes, and in the midst upon a golden pyramid was set an image of Laurelin, the tree of the sun, with flowers wrought of topaz in long clusters upon chains of gold. And the gate itself was adorned with discs of gold many-rayed, in likenesses of the sun, set amid devices of garnet and topaz and yellow diamonds. In the court beyond were arrayed 300 archers with long bows, and their mail was gilded, and tall golden plumes rose from their helmets, and their great round shields were red as flame. Now sunlight fell upon the further road, for the walls of the hills were low on either side, and green, but for the snows upon their tops. And Elamachiel hastened forward, for the way was short to the 7th gate, named the Great, the gate of steel that Maeglin wrought after the return from the Near Naiath, across the wide entrance to the Orfalch Echo. No wall stood there, but on either hand were 2 round towers of great height, many-windowed, tapering in 7 stories to a turret of bright steel. And between the towers there stood a mighty fence of steel that rusted not, but glittered cold and white. 7 great pillars of steel there were, tall with the height and girth of strong young trees, but ending in a bitter spike that rose to the sharpness of a needle. And between the pillars were 7 crossbars of steel, and in each space 7 times 7 rods of steel upright with heads like the broad blades of spears. But in the centre, above the midmost pillar and the greatest, was raised a mighty image of the king helm of Turgon, the crown of the hidden kingdom, set about with diamonds. No gate or door could Tuor see in this mighty hedge of steel, but as he drew near through the spaces between the bars, there came, as it seemed to him, a dazzling light, and he shaded his eyes and stood still in dread and wonder. But Elamachiel went forward, and no gate opened to his touch, but he struck upon a bar, and the fence rang like a harp of many strings, giving forth clear notes in harmony that ran from tower to tower. Straightway there issued riders from the towers, but before those of the north tower came one upon a white horse, and he dismounted and strode towards them. And high and noble as was Elamachiel, greater and more lordly was Ecthelion, lord of the fountains, at that time warden of the great gate. All in silver was he clad, and upon his shining helm was set a spike of steel pointed with a diamond, and as his esquire took his shield, it shimmered as if it were bedewed with drops of rain, that were indeed 1,000 studs of crystal. Elamachiel saluted him and said, "Here have I brought Voronwe Aranwion, returning from Balar, and here is the stranger that he has led hither, who demands to see the king." Then Ecthelion turned to Tuor, but he drew his cloak about him and stood silent, facing him. And it seemed to Voronwe that a mist mantled Tuor, and his stature was increased, so that the peak of his high hood overtopped the helm of the elf lord, as it were the crest of a grey sea-wave riding to the land. But Ecthelion bent his bright glance upon Tuor, and after a silence he spoke gravely, saying,
"At this point the carefully written manuscript ends, and there follows only a rough text scribbled on a scrap of paper.
You have come to the last gate. Know then that no stranger who passes it shall ever go out again, save by the door of death. Speak not ill-boding. If the messenger of the Lord of Waters go by that door, then all those who dwell here will follow him. Lord of the Fountains, hinder not the messenger of the Lord of Waters." Then Voronwe and all those who stood near looked again in wonder at Tuor, marvelling at his words and voice. And to Voronwe it seemed as if he heard a great voice, but as of one who called from afar off. But to Tuor it seemed that he listened to himself speaking, as if another spoke with his mouth. For a while Ecthelion stood silent, looking at Tuor, and slowly awe filled his face, as if in the grey shadow of Tuor's cloak he saw visions from far away. Then he bowed, and went to the fence and laid hands upon it, and gates opened inward on either side of the pillar of the crown. Then Tuor passed through, and coming to a high sward that looked out over the valley beyond, he beheld a vision of Gondolin amid the white snow. And so entranced was he that for long he could look at nothing else. For he saw before him at last the vision of his desire out of dreams of longing. Thus he stood and spoke no word. Silent upon either hand stood a host of the army of Gondolin. All of the 7 kinds of the 7 gates were there represented, but their captains and chieftains were upon horses, white and grey. Then, even as they gazed on Tuor in wonder, his cloak fell, and he stood there before them in the mighty livery of Nevrast. And many were there who had seen Turgon himself set these things upon the wall behind the high seat of Vinyamar. Then Ecthelion said at last, "Now no further proof is needed, and even the name he claims as son of Huor matters less than this clear proof that he comes from Ulmo himself."
Here this text comes to an end, but there follow some rapidly written notes, sketching out elements of the narrative as my father at that time foresaw it. Tuor asked the name of the city, and was told its 7 names. See the tale of the Fall of Gondolin. Ecthelion gave orders for the sounding of the signal, and trumpets were blown on the towers of the great gate. Then answering trumpets were heard, blown far off on the city walls. On horseback they rode to the city, of which a description was to follow, of the great gate, the trees, the place of the fountain, and of the king's house, and then would be described the welcome of Tuor by Turgon. Beside the throne would be seen Maeglin on the right and Idril on the left, and Tuor would declare the message of Ulmo. There is also a note saying that there was to be a description of the city as Tuor saw it from afar, and that it was to be recounted why there was no queen of Gondolin.